Today, I'm going to be speaking with Professor Catherine Liu, who teaches at University of California, Irvine, and is also author of the new book, Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class. It's so great to have you on today.
Thank you, David.
So there's certainly a narrative I think much of my audience will be familiar with, that is often used in some populist circles about elites and non-elites, or an overclass and an underclass. And what one of the things your book does that's interesting is you're sort of focusing in on a specific slice that's smaller than such a simple division, the managerial class, professional managerial class. Let's start there. What is that? Who's included in it, et cetera?
So, the professional managerial class is an intermediary class. A lot of classic Marxists call it the petit bourgeois because it's located between the working class, which is the mass of people without college degrees now in late capitalism in America, and the capitalists. So, this class, uniquely though in the United States, has become really, really important, exports one of the most important American creations of the post-war period, the meritocracy, and it basically does the bidding of capitalism and the capitalist by producing, now we think of it as content and ideological content to justify the really staggering levels of inequality and exploitation that keep capitalism going. So this class are college educated white collar workers who I like to say do jobs that don't entail physical damage to their bodies. Now, they could actually damage themselves psychologically and intellectually, which I think is actually the case. But what they do is reproduce the ideology of the class system to make it seem like it's justified that rich people are rich, and it's justified that the masses are poor, and that there are no universal programs that would actually create a more equitable society. Now, this is to say, though, in 1977, when John and Barbara Ehrenreich wrote about this class has taken over left and progressive liberal organizing spaces. So it thinks of itself as being on the side of progress
Right.
and virtuous and good, but actually its actions serve only to reproduce the interests of capitalism.
Yeah, this is it. So I think many in the audience may realize that when you tell me, is it correct to call this a Marxist perspective?
Yes.
Yeah. As a non-Marxist myself, I still think that the analysis has a lot of very interesting things that are accurate. And one of the things I was thinking of during the rise of the Tea Party in 2010 was that a lot of the people that were supporting the Tea Party, they were definitely never going to benefit from much of what the Tea Party was advocating for. Like, it wasn't even there was a chance they would benefit. They
Right.
statistically, they just weren't going to benefit. What I think is interesting about the managerial class that you're talking about
Mhm.
is that they actually, to some degree, could benefit from the propping up of the actual overclass that you describe. And
Mhm.
so there actually seems to be, if you want to talk about rationality, it actually seems more rational to me that they would prop that system up, whereas it made less sense with the Tea Party people.
But I think the Tea Party people and populists, about which I've written in the past, are animated by a rage against the economic system that's
Mm,
left them marginalized. But what they support were free markets, but also traditional values, and they hated the liberal elites, right?
yes,
Because they thought the liberal elites had created the crisis in which they found themselves, and they're not wrong.
right.
A lot of them were not college educated people. They were small business people, or we'd say like craftsmen, or there was like the classic Joe the plumber who turned out to be a fake. But um, these there were these this population in America, which I would say are non-college educated people, after World War II, were really copiously rewarded by the redistribution of wealth that was put into place by both Republican and Democratic
Right.
administrations after 1945. But since 1972, as you know, the middle and the working classes have seen their wages stagnate, actually go down. We've seen the social safety net be destroyed. And so a lot of the actual economic damage that people suffered from in the Tea Party setting, and I would say also in Trump supporters, had to do with the imposition of this kind of neoliberal austerity politics and actually free markets that were engineered by economists, academics, and elites after 1972 of both parties, right? So what they wanted in the Tea Party was less government because they thought the government had created, the financial crisis, and the government did participate in creating the financial crisis, but it was Wall Street and financiers, as you know, who really produced this crisis in capital that destroyed $1 trillion in American assets like overnight. And there was this fantasy that the Tea Party had, that it was people borrowing on with bad credit who
Right.
overspent and they were to blame, and somehow the government and the bank and some banks participated in that. I heard this line repeated to me by a very wealthy liberal who said, you know what caused this crisis? All those people couldn't afford the houses, and everyone wants a flat screen TV. So, in fact, she's actually being more rational, although wrong, because it was actually Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and AIG that created the crisis. The credit default swap created the crisis, but there's this idea that there are these poor people over consuming who had bad credit, and they brought the world economy to its knees. And so the Tea Party had that idea, and they were like all mad on Fox News, but also MSNBC, CNN watching elite liberals had that same idea. So there's actually this consensus about how poor people caused the financial crisis that Tea Partiers and liberal elites shared, PMC liberal elites shared. And
Yeah,
so
I don't know if this is I don't know if this is analog or part of or parallel to your analysis, but to some degree what I'm hearing you say about the Tea Party and then also some on the left is similar to, I use the term bamboozling, but there's probably a different term that could be used, that the populist rhetoric has succeeded with over the last many years, where it pulls in people from both left and right with what are typically different voting patterns and stated values that would differ, but the rhetoric starts to sound similar on the left and right, but then the solutions don't match up when you actually ask people, well, how would you solve this problem?
but there's a similar level of irrationality. And what I think is really insane is that the professional managerial classes have always prided themselves on being rational and being
Right.
reasonable. They're located in the university. They all went to fancy universities and have credentials, but they are utterly irrational right now. And I think that the Russiagate thing is a really good example of their irrationality. Like, what happened to that? But nobody's supposed to not trust MSNBC after they made that whole kerfuffle about something that they had no proof for. So that's something that's in the book too, is how I show the PMC elites now do not abide by the high liberal values of either due process or reason, rational argument in the public sphere. And certainly on the right, people do not believe in reason and rational argument in the public sphere either. So the state of our politics today has it finds ourselves in this position where nobody wants to defend argument, reasonable people debating each other, not agreeing with each other. And the PMC liberals like to blame this on Fox News and blame this on extreme right forces, but they are policing their own boundaries in the same exact way. And they're demonizing their antagonists to make them seem like they really don't deserve to even exist or vote, and then they say the Republicans want to suppress the vote. But I think that there's a lot of contempt for non-college educated Americans, working class Americans, that's actually in the PMC itself.
Yeah, the part that is less clear to me is the Russiagate piece, because it seems to me that certainly there were some people who very early on were setting expectations that were unreasonable, like Trump's going to be caught on video planning something with Putin, that was never going to happen. Trump's going to end up in prison. That was never going to happen. You go back to my videos from April of 2017, and that's what I said all along. But in great part, I don't see, maybe MSNBC was doing different things than I saw. I don't really watch any MSNBC or that type of stuff. But from the perspective of this led to not only more than a dozen indictments, but it actually found enough wrongdoing to recover more money than the investigation cost. It is very clear that Donald Trump was a useful idiot in a number of different ways, and part of it did overlap with. I don't know that I see that as the same thing that you see it as necessarily.
Okay, well, that is a very reasonable take, and I totally appreciate that. What I think was what I was talking about more, I guess, is the energy of condemnation that they were sure was going to lead to an impeachment.
I see.
And it works only partially, but it's so different. I was alive during, you're probably too young to remember Watergate, when there was bipartisan condemnation of Nixon, when the work was done to bring in the Republicans and say something so bad has happened,
Yeah.
something so illegal has happened that we have to condemn this person. And the Russiagate thing did find wrongdoing, but it didn't actually create, because our politics are so polarized now, a national consensus
But I
about
think that's an indictment of the Republican Party. I think
yes.
because when I
Okay.
see there was a point in Watergate where the reason there was not impeachment was because it became clear that Nixon was going down if it went that far because Republicans. I think that the reason it went the way it did is an indictment on Republicans.
No, I absolutely agree. But I also think there's the core, an
Yeah.
irrational core, if you like, of Republican support, popular support for Trump, or right wing popular support for Trump, that is animated by hatred of the professional managerial class.
Mm.
And the more you have these liberal talking heads, pumping people up about cultural issues, ignoring actual bread and butter economic issues or the suffering of
Yeah.
the majority of Americans, the more you will have this label of hypocrisy being thrown at liberal elites. And this idea also that there are worthy people to help and unworthy people to help, that is usually a Republican and right wing talking point. But the liberal elite, PMC, has actually done this completely. Like, there are good poor people and there are bad working class people. And we're going to give all of the moral iniquity to the other side. Well, and they do not see their complicity in actually bringing us to a state where the country is so polarized and so divided and animated by these class antagonisms and hatreds that should be talked about rationally. They can't do that, though, because that would mean that they were not saintly in some way. I think the PMC has tried to cloak itself in a kind of saintly identity that always has to put itself on the right side of things. Let's look at the state of California. We have an incredible homeless problem that is in large part generated by regulations on housing and land use in the state. The PMC here in the state, though, they rule, right? The Democratic elites have supermajorities and everything in every legislative branch in this state, and yet they can only put up Black Lives Matters signs
Mm.
in their yards, and they refuse to have lower income housing built in their neighborhoods or homeless shelters built in their neighborhoods, or even create higher density housing so that we're not living in suburban enclave, suburban hell.
Right.
This 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 um, this state, with its veneer of liberalism and its preachiness about tolerance, has actually created this kind of dystopia of inequality that they don't really actually want to solve. Look at the San Francisco School Board. They stopped this now, but rather than asking for funding to get schools open in the correct way, supporting teachers and students, they wanted to rename San Francisco public schools, 44 of them, one of them named after Abraham Lincoln because of the racism of the past. To
Right.
me, that just infuriates me so much because, first of all, I don't like Dianne Feinstein. I don't think she should have a school name but after her. But if you just go after these cosmetic things and then you say people who are from the past, like Lincoln, were racist, what the PMC there is saying is, everyone who came before us are racist. We're enlightened, and we're going to create a cosmetic, superficial veneer of tolerance and anti-racism, ignoring all of the structural economic inequalities that has made the San Francisco school system majority minority, right? African American, Latinos, and Asian American working class people use that public school system. The wealthy elites of all, they're mostly white, but some of them Asian, some of them African American, some of them elite, Latino, they send their kids to private schools. And this is what has happened in every city in the country, is this kind of lip service to public education and this undermining of public goods so that the upper tier of the PMC can enjoy privatized education, and everyone else is left with poor quality mass education that nevertheless has a veneer of tolerance. And that's like a great PMC strategy for virtue hoarding and reproducing economic inequality.
So, in the very limited time we have left, I want to get your thoughts on how we've talked about this issue of the cultural fights that, particularly in the Trump era, the right is not, they're not even pretending to be about policy anymore. It's Dr. Seuss, it's cancel culture, et cetera, et cetera. As a strategic calculation, should the left fight these cultural issues, or should they just ignore them and focus on policy or something else?
Well, the left doesn't have much of a commitment to freedom of speech right now. So I think if the left fights these issues, I'm not sure what they're going to actually be standing on, because they actually don't want Dr. Seuss books to be reproduced. Those books are really problematic in many ways, but
Yeah.
also a lot of people enjoyed those books. I enjoyed those books for my kids and for my kid. And so I feel like the culture war aspect of American politics serves elites on both sides of the party. You see what I mean? So it doesn't.
I
As
guess the reason I
advocates,
think it serves the right more is
yeah,
that the left has a package right now when it comes to infrastructure, foreign policy, taxation, pandemic, that's absent from a lot of the new right. So it strikes me that it would be better for the left to focus on that.
their policies. I am always someone who's for focusing on economic material issues.
Okay.
That is the bottom line. Who benefits, who doesn't benefit, remain focused on the economics. That's, I think, always going to work much better and actually deliver for people. Not just focus on economic policies that will create more redistribution of wealth, but really deliver. I think the vaccine is a sign that there can be like publicly funded health initiatives,
Yeah.
and you should focus on that. We should focus on creating strong infrastructure within public health, universal health care, universal quality childcare, all of these bread and butter issues that people need in their lives desperately right now. And if you can produce that, then you can produce a sense of the collective. You can produce a sense of progressive liberal policies that work for people. Yes. And so, in that sense, they should not take the bait. The left should not take the bait on the cultural
Right.
issues. They should absolutely deflect. I've been agnostic on Biden, but I do feel like he's much more progressive than Obama, and that his stimulus package should be something that is executed with the greatest fervor and authority. And here's one thing I'm going to end with, is that I'm not playing the PMC blame game where I say, oh, the PMC, they're all bad. No, we need good professionals. You can't have infrastructural reconstruction of this country without a return to the professional standards of both like stockbroking or research in universities or policy making and think tanks that is shielded from the market. Right now, all of these knowledge workers are so driven by profit, and we need to go back to non-market professional standards of being. And that's, I think, something that we often lose track of in the left. And we think like, oh, anybody who's a bureaucrat is bad. How are you going to spend $1.9 trillion correctly or well without a good functioning bureaucracy, without a good functioning government? That's why I have no patience for the anarcho leftists.
Yes, you and me both. You and me both. The book is Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class. We've been speaking, of course, with the book's author, Professor Catherine Liu. So great to have you on today.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much.